the extremely high number of unidentified dead bodies is being described as a silent mass disaster. That's at least according to a recent report published in the Lancet Global Health, which says unidentified dead bodies require urgent attention as it poses a global health risk. Just yesterday, the Gauteng Health Department, closer to home, released a statement calling for families to come to identify 25 dead bodies at Chris Baragwanath Hospital in Johannesburg. The report, which was co-authored by 14 specialists around the world, also unpacks, among other things, ethical concerns around unidentified bodies. Let's unpack it further with one of the co-authors of this report, who's also the head of the African Center for Medicolegal Systems at International Committee of the Red Cross. That's Stephen Fonseca, who joins us via our video link this morning. And Stephen, it's lovely to have you on the program. Thanks so much indeed for making time. And there's just so much to unpack around this particular issue. Perhaps let's begin with just placing into context the scale of this problem. As I mentioned, it's being described as a silent mass disaster. How many people are we talking roughly?
Thanks for having me back again at Newzroom Afrika, Ayanda. So the International Committee of the Red Cross is fortunate where it's a global humanitarian institution. We're in many countries, primarily looking at conflict, but then also looking at disasters and migration being one of those. And so we have a global sort of understanding of the protracted challenge that this has been for authorities, for national authorities. Unidentified bodies are literally peppered across mortuaries, across Africa and across the world for a number of different reasons. I mean, there's a lot of global movement today. We live in a global community, and so people do tend to move around. And that causes many people to become disassociated with the family members that might have been needed to attend a mortuary to identify their loved one. And so the number just keeps growing, even though the science has improved. You know, forensic sciences has developed dramatically. And we would say that science is no longer the problem, but the way that unidentified bodies are being managed systematically is certainly a huge problem across the world.
Yeah, and where do you reckon the gaps currently lie? I mean, if we're not managing it properly, how do we at least get that right?
Yeah, so again, you know, we talk about a disaster victim identification approach. If you look at a disaster like Libya, for instance, you can see that there's literally thousands and thousands of people are missing. They have already recovered thousands of unidentified bodies. And when the country, and I'm not referring to Libya in this particular statement, but when countries don't have a disaster preparedness plan that includes mass fatality planning, what happens is there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to bury bodies very quickly without collecting information about them. And so those families that don't have an immediate sort of the ability to approach a mortuary and claim their loved one right away lose that opportunity sometimes forever to actually ever get their loved ones back, because nothing was collected from the deceased in terms of personal identification information, scars, marks, tattoos, DNA samples, fingerprints, etc. And so it's actually the system very often that is causing people to go missing. And a lot of this has to do with not having the families participating and not having something to compare against. And the same problem lies here in South Africa. There's many unidentified bodies across the mortuaries in South Africa, and it's not for lack of trying. They're just, what do they have to compare against? So that's where the system is failing. There needs to be a far greater impetus put towards families becoming involved, having access to report, not fearing any sort of repercussions if somebody is an irregular migrant, but still being able to come forward, report their loved one missing so that they've got something to compare against and ultimately identify that individual.
Sure. What a sobering discussion, especially because it also brings up a couple of ethical and value-laden questions, right? I mean, on the one hand, even if authorities around the world want to be patient with families and ensure that, this information does reach them, they can only keep the bodies for so long. But at the same time, it's important to at least give these people who are victims of whatever circumstance the dignity of being identified and perhaps being reconnected with their families.
Yeah, and RCRC termed this phrase humanitarian forensic action because, as I say, the science has developed so much that, if there is a deceased individual and there is something to compare against, identification is fairly easy today compared to what it was, 2 decades ago. But we have to be pragmatic as well. And, bodies still decompose in mortuaries. It's not as if you put a body in a fridge, they're not going to decompose. They just decompose at a slower rate. So, there's a lot of logistical and ethical issues around how long do you hold a body for, waiting for a family that may not come in the next week or 2 weeks, but may only come when an opportunity is presented in their own country or in a different province where they can actually contribute to providing the information that is needed. So yes, when we talk about dignity, we also don't want to see bodies just lingering in mortuaries, decomposing over months and months without having a dignified burial. So long as all the information was collected from that individual and that information is retained in perpetuity, so that when the family do show up, there is at least something to compare against. And that's where the challenge lies, is getting ensuring that there's a timely burial, but don't bury a body before you've collected everything that needs to be, stored for any potential identification. And when I mean identification today, it's not just DNA. It's scars, marks, tattoos, unique features, circumstances, fingerprints, DNA, dental comparisons. So there's so many different avenues towards making an identification, but the system has to be able to accommodate that both nationally and transnationally.
Absolutely. Part of what you mentioned in your report is that, the prevalence of unidentified bodies exists mostly in low-income and middle-income countries. And I suppose that's for obvious reasons, right? There lies communities or families who in many ways don't have means sometimes to go and try find their loved ones. And sometimes the technology in those countries is lagging.
That's 100% correct. I mean, the one big issue that we see, and we've gone out, the ICRC has certainly worked with authorities, gone out to very rural communities where they don't even have cell phone coverage. So how would they report someone missing? They would have to literally find transport, pay for transport to go to a police station, which may or may not even take their case, because they would argue that the person didn't go missing in the local community. They need to go to the community where the person went missing. So there's a lot of challenges for the families to be able to report, and that becomes ever more or ever increasingly difficult when you're in a lower income community and you just don't have those facilities. On the flip side, you're absolutely correct that DNA technology and other types of methods that are used routinely in disaster victim identification, for instance, are not always available to all the countries. So even if you've got a country like South Africa, which has a very advanced medicolegal system, we do have laboratories, we have all the various types of forensic experts, even if they collected all this information, which we strongly encourage regardless, they just may not necessarily have the DNA sample collected from families to compare against, because that particular country doesn't have the capacity to actually do that. And so that's why it's important for ICRC and a lot of other international partners to work with all the authorities to start looking at this problem as a transnational problem. I just quickly, it's also important to realize that this global community we are seeing Africans being found dead on the American border. Wow. So we can see how far people are actually moving in the hope of finding, a future for themselves, some sort of progress and some sort of development for their children, something that they can look forward to in the future. So people are moving around a lot, but it's not just migrants. And I don't want, South Africans to think that this is just a migrant issue. It's not. In our studies and the work that we did with Johannesburg, for instance, of those that we ultimately identified, or that the authorities identified, in fact, half of those were South Africans. And so there's a lot of systematic challenges that the states have to deal with, both internally within a country and then externally, to ensure that there's a secure but confidential way of sharing information, personal information, that would ultimately render these types of cases resolved.
Absolutely. It's a transnational problem. It presents logistical difficulties, but I suppose we're also yet to take stock of the mental toll this takes on families who are looking for their loved ones, but quite frankly may never find them. In fact, you describe it as an ambiguous loss in your report. And just very quickly, anecdotally, I happen to come from a family where there's been a missing great-grandfather. And even though it happened years ago, in fact, I've never met him, to this day, there are stories about this person who's never been found. And I suppose that really just gives us a picture of the psychological toll this takes on families.
Yeah, so families never stop giving up, and nor should they. And families, I've worked with families where their loved ones have gone missing as far back as the 60s, the 1960s, 1970s, and we've been fortunate enough with the family support to actually find these remains that were processed at one point in the system, and then identify them. And families really teach us as forensic experts what it truly means to be suffering. This emotional burden, this psychological burden, and it's extremely stressful. It can destroy families. It can destroy their careers as they continue to look for their son, their daughter, their parents, whoever it is. It really it takes hold of their life, and that becomes their only that's their focus. They absolutely need to find their loved one. Whether they're alive or dead, they want to know. And so it's so important that we don't just see this as a sort of a forensic problem, but it's truly a humanitarian problem. The impact is enormous on families and societies, because we'll see that in a number of lower income communities, it's not one person that's gone missing. It's often many people that have gone missing, and they're often the breadwinner as well. So you see the next generation suffering tremendously because those breadwinners have gone and they don't have a father. Some of them don't have a father or mother because they've gone missing. And climate change is going to definitely have a much greater impact on exactly this problem, where people are going to go missing. And if the system hasn't improved, a lot more families are going to suffer this ambiguous loss and continue to look. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know you've said this is not a migrant issue, but I imagine, for a lot of people, that's what comes up. And I wonder how concerned you are as a scientist about the attitude that many governments are having towards migrants and migration. I mean, you even have leaders, including the Pope, raising real concerns about ways in which we're treating people who are moving around the world for different opportunities. Because in my mind, if that attitude, for instance, in South Africa, we're approaching an election, it's going to be a big political issue. If governments don't strike the right tones, it may have a bearing on resource allocation and may very well affect our ability to finally get this right.
Yeah, exactly. And if we don't look at this as a humanitarian problem, it's never going to get resolved. Because the truth of it is, if somebody somebody goes missing and they're considered irregular in a country, their associates and their families don't actually know if they're dead or alive, and therefore they're very reluctant to come forward to the authorities because they could expose their loved one and get them, and they could be deported, or they're just afraid themselves of being deported. And so they have the information that the authorities need. So when we look at how to deal with this problem and consider the migrants as part of that problem, then we have to look at it in a far more humanitarian sort of perspective, that these cases require a humanitarian approach, so that any person can come forward and provide information to ensure that somebody is identified in the mortuary. So long as people are not able to come forward, there just simply isn't anything to compare against. So that's one of the real issues. The migrants do present a huge logistical challenge, because often their bodies remain unidentified for a long period of time because families don't know where to go, where to make inquiries, where to search, if they're brave enough to come forward. So there's huge issues on the public system to accommodate all of these bodies over a prolonged period. Most mortuaries are expecting the family to come forward the day after somebody's been reported dead, come do a visual recognition, make the identification, and the body is released right away to a funeral home. That's not happening in these types of cases. These bodies are sadly literally decomposing over time until they have to bury, they have no other choice. And then they sit in the cemetery, and those cemeteries are also now having to absorb huge numbers of people. While not in South Africa, we have seen in other parts, in other countries, where those bodies are being buried and they're not even buried in a traceable way. So when families do come, they will never get their loved one back, even if there was an identification opportunity, because they're buried in common graves, and there's just too many people in one grave, and those individuals have not been properly marked, and the graves have not been properly marked and mapped to go and recover that body. So families, and especially in the African culture where recovering and returning your loved one back to your community is so important, that's where we're going to see real humanitarian challenges and really let the family down a second time.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. I shudder at the thought of how many stories and unanswered prayers and questions are buried with many people who may never be found again. Stephen Fonseca, great speaking to you, sir. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Stephen, of course, part of the International Committee of the Red Cross.